Welcome everyone to the Otherworldly Encounters Iceberg, where we'll be exploring cases of people encountering things that seem beyond our world. This will include things like inhumans, time slips, and a bunch of other obscure cases you've probably never heard. And just before we begin, I took the time to make this iceberg myself and made sure to include a lot of unknown and obscure encounters, so if you guys like this sort of stuff, make sure to like and subscribe, it helps the channel out. Anyways, let's get straight into video now with the first entry of Tier 1. The transdimensional gas station. In July of 1993, an 18-year-old named David experienced an event that left a lasting mark on his memory. David was working at the civic department in the small county of Mulby in mid-eastern Sweden, spending the summer maintaining streets and parks. On this particular day, David and a coworker had just finished their tasks in a remote community about 15 kilometers from their home office and were on their way back in a Volkswagen minibus. The road they traveled was always familiar, flanked by fields and pine forests with only a few scattered farmhouses and cottages. As they drove though, David's coworker noticed that the fuel gauge was nearing empty. They debated whether to radio their home office for help, but decided to press on, hoping that the remaining fuel would last. They had entered a wooden section of the road by now when they came across a collection of buildings that neither of them had ever seen. There was a dilapidated farmhouse and a long shed-like structure with an old-fashioned gas pump in front. The shed had a sign in the window that read gas. Despite having driven this road many times, the gas station seemed entirely new to them. They then pulled up to the pump, which was padlocked, and David went inside to find the attendant. The inside was a small square room with a counter, shelves of oil cans, and a single fluorescent lamp providing light. After calling out, a peculiar old man then emerged. He wore a Greek fisherman cap, thick rimmed glasses that magnified his eyes, and shabby clothes. David asked for gas, and after a long pause, the man nodded and handed him a key on a string, then moved inside with a lurching gait. The old man then unlocked the pump and they filled their tank with 150 SA worth of gas, a slow process because of the aged equipment. The man simply watched them the entire time, rocking side to side. After paying with loose change, the man gave them a handwritten receipt. They left quickly, feeling uneasy, but not recognizing the full strangeness of the encounter. As they drove away, the car began to run poorly, misfiring and emitting thick black smoke, typical of a patrol engine running on diesel. Then, when they were at the repair shop, they pumped the fuel into a tub and found it to be an opaque orange liquid that smelled sweet like turpentine. The repairman remarked that it resembled wartime gasoline, a mix used during fuel shortages in World War II. When they mentioned the gas station, he was bewildered, insisting that no such place ever existed on that road. Spooked out, David and his friend drove back to find the gas station, but saw no sign of it. The area where it should have been was completely empty. The incident haunted David, who kept the receipt and later shared the story with his grandfather, who mentioned having a similar experience on that same road years earlier but refused to elaborate. Mangled footprints in the basement. So this story comes from a Redditor who recounted an unsettling incident in their house built on an area that was once an open prairie where Native American artifacts were found. He had moved into the house as a young teenager with his mother after his parents' divorce. Initially, the house seemed spacious and cozy, but strange occurrences began to happen more frequently as he became aware of them. The incident involved hearing footsteps coming from downstairs while brushing his teeth in the evening. Although he assumed it was his mother, there was never anyone there when he checked. These anomalous footsteps became common, especially at night, leading him to believe that the house was haunted. One day, he and a friend decided to go to the basement, seeking relief from the summer heat while his mother was away on a business trip. They noticed that the yellow submarine poster at the bottom of the stairwell was tilted slightly to the left. Ignoring it though, they entered the main room of the basement, which was covered with various pictures and posters, all similarly tilted to the left. This sight sort of unsettled them, but the eeriness escalated when they saw the storage room door slightly open. This storage room door, with the dirt floor about 4 feet off the ground, emitted a golden glow. A pull cord light located about 10 feet away from the storage room door was turned on. The witness, wanting to eliminate the eerie glow, crawled into the storage room on his hands and knees to turn off the light. After doing so though, he called his mother, hoping for a natural explanation, but she confirmed she hadn't been in the basement for weeks before her trip. A shiver then ran down his spine as he looked back into the storage room, only to find a distorted and mangled footprint in the dirt. The footprint was unlike anything he had ever seen, and he froze in fear. His friend had a similar reaction, and they wordlessly exchanged a look of gut-wrenching dread before slamming the storage room door shut and fleeing the house as fast as they could. The memory of that footprint still haunted the witness. The thought of crawling into a storage space to turn off the light still gives him chills. The encounter left a lasting impression on him, making it difficult for him to feel at ease in the house again. Night Lights of Dr. White. On January 4th, 1969, Dr. White and his wife were driving through the Isle of Wight to reach the village of Knighton. The full moon provided enough light to see the surrounding fields, which were mostly empty and quiet. As they drove along a secluded road in the central part of the isle, they noticed unusual lights ahead of them. These lights appeared to be bobbing, similar to torches carried by a group of people. As they continued up the hill, they saw fields to their right filled with these twinkling lights, resembling a large city. Initially, they thought they might be witnessing shepherds or an agriculture exhibition, but they quickly realized this didn't make sense on a cold January night. Approaching what they believed to be a small cart track leading to a local farm, the couple suddenly found themselves driving down a well-lit city street with buildings on either side. The area was illuminated by red, green, and orange lights. As they drove through this confusing scene, they suddenly returned to the farm track they had originally intended to follow. Looking back, they saw only the farm track under the moonlight, with no sign of the city or its lights. The couple then continued their journey, now approaching the Hare and Hounds Inn, which was a familiar landmark south of Newport. As they neared the inn, they saw it bathed in an unusual light. Figures carrying torches then ran across the road, and the fields around them were once again dotted with strange lights. Suddenly, a tall man dressed in a leather jerkin and a broad belt darted in the road ahead of them. Dr. White considered stopping the car to ask what was happening, but the lights and the figures vanished just 20 yards from the inn, which now appeared normal with its usual lights. Feeling unnerved, the Whites decided not to stop at the inn and continued to Knighton. The next morning, they returned to the area to make sense of their experience, but found nothing unusual. Some paranormal investigators speculated that the couple might have seen a mirage reflecting a nearby city like Portsmouth, but this seemed unlikely because of their proximity to what they saw. Mrs. White suggested they might have witnessed events from another era, possibly seeing a Viking encampment or a Roman camp, as the tall man seemed more Viking than Roman. However, the appearance of an urban environment with handheld lights and historical clothing suggested a more complex time slip, possibly involving multiple time periods. The experience left the Whites and investigators completely puzzled. The couple had no further encounters of this nature, and the phenomenon was never explained. Subterranean centaur scare. In the early days of March 1913, the Chickasaw mine in Kittanning, Pennsylvania, was bustling with activity as hundreds of miners worked deep underground. The oppressive heat and darkness of the mine were constant in their daily lives, but on this particular day, the miners would experience something truly extraordinary. The incident began with a strange and unsettling sound echoing through the subterranean tunnels. The miners, accustomed to the usual clamor of their work environment, were weirded out by the distinct sounds of hoofbeats reverberating off the mine walls. As the hoofbeats grew louder, a ghostly light began to illuminate the darkness, casting eerie shadows and signaling the arrival of something otherworldly. Out of the darkness emerged a figure that defied all logic and reason. It was a centaur, a creature straight out of ancient mythology, with the upper body of a man and the lower body of a horse. The centaur moved through the mine with a purpose, and it started commanding the miners to abandon their tools and flee for their lives. The sight of such a creature immediately caused a wave of panic to sweep through the miners. One by one, the miners dropped their tools and bolted for the mine's entrance. Among these miners was John Martel, the driver of the mine motor, who found himself face to face with this centaur. The creature materialized before him, pointing a bony finger in his direction and uttering a single word, "Go." Paralyzed with fear, Martel was unable to move at first. The sight of the centaur's skeletal frame and its glowing eyes seemed to freeze him in place. When he finally regained control of his limbs though, he let out a scream and sprinted towards the mine's entrance. As he ran, he glanced over his shoulder and saw that the centaur had taken control of the motor and was pursuing him down the tracks. Martel's flight to the mine was a frantic blur, his heart pounding in his chest as he raced towards the daylight. Just as he neared the exit, he looked back one last time to see the centaur-driven motor close behind him. He burst out into the sunlight, gasping for breath and trembling with fear. The miners refused to return to work the following day, with the terror still fresh and their belief in the supernatural encounter unshaken. The incident was then reported in the March 19, 1913 edition of the Philadelphia Inquirer, detailing the miners' experience and the subsequent paralysis of the mine's operations. The Void. So this story comes from Robert, who recounted a strange experience he had while living in the Hawaiian Islands in the 1980s. Basically, he had just moved to Hawaii to relax after years of intense travel. Living in a sparsely populated valley, he met a couple named Tom and Ann who lived on the other side of a river. To visit them, Robert either walked down to a bridge and then up the road to their property or simply crossed the river. The jungle had no streetlights, so they used flashlights or lighters at night. Tom and Ann seemed nice people, hospitable and welcoming. Tom was a musician and had a vast knowledge of plants, creating a beautiful garden. Ann was an excellent cook, and together they became good friends, and Robert visited them daily. One night, after several months, Robert was at their house enjoying food and conversation. As he looked down at his plate though, Tom and Ann suddenly stopped talking mid-sentence. When Robert looked up, he saw them frozen in time, their mouths wide open and their eyes and mouths completely black. This black was unlike anything he had ever seen before, almost like a void from another dimension. Their mouths were as black as their eyes, and Robert could feel the blackness. Fear struck him immediately. He then stood up, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. He wasn't under the influence of any substances, and he was seeing something beyond his understanding. As he sat back down, contemplating running away through the dark jungle to get home, everything returned to normal as if a light switch had been turned back on. The episode lasted simply about 15 seconds, but it felt much longer because of the shock. Robert had a clear chance to make sure of what he was seeing. After everything returned to normal, Robert was left with extreme fear and an overwhelming sense that he needed to leave ASAP. Tom and Ann asked what was wrong, and he apologized, saying he had to go. After that, for weeks, Robert didn't visit Tom and Ann, only seeing them occasionally. He never told them what he saw, feeling it was impossible to explain. The overwhelming sense during the episode was extreme fear and being in the presence of evil. Since the encounter, Robert has been haunted by the experience. He reports still being scared when thinking about it, convinced that something real happened. Not long after the incident, Robert left Hawaii. He developed an extreme fear of heights and began experiencing panic attacks while driving. He wondered if these issues were connected somehow to his encounter with Tom and Ann. The extreme fear he felt when looking into the black voids might have stayed with him. Robert has been trying to understand and come to terms with what he really witnessed that day. He lives with the memory of the experience, which seemed to have a lasting impact on his mental health. The fear he felt that night and the changes in his life afterward led him to believe that he definitely encountered something truly evil that day. Lead Mask's Case. In August 1966, a chilling mystery unfolded on Vintem Hill in Niterói, Brazil, involving the bizarre deaths of two TV repairmen, Manuel Pereira da Cruz and Miguel Jose Viana. Their bodies were discovered by a young boy who was flying his kite in the area. The circumstances surrounding their deaths were peculiar and sparked a lot of widespread speculation. Both men were found lying side by side, dressed in suits and waterproof coats, which was really unusual given the weather at the time. Beside them, authorities found an empty water bottle and a packet containing 2 towels. Strangely, they were also wearing lead masks typically used to protect against radiation, which had no eye holes. A notebook found near the bodies contained cryptic instructions which read 1630, be at the determined place, 1830, swallow capsules, after effect protect metals, wait for mass signal. This note suggested that their deaths were premeditated and possibly linked to a larger unknown plan. The investigation revealed that Pereira and Viana had traveled from Campos to Niterói, purportedly to purchase electronic equipment and a vehicle for their business. But before their journey to the hill, they stopped at a local shop where they purchased the water bottle and raincoats. A witness at the bar where they made their purchase mentioned that Viana seemed anxious and frequently checked his watch, indicating that they were on a tight schedule. Interestingly, the scene showed no signs of struggle or violence though, and the position of the body suggested that they had laid down willingly. The absence of the toxicology report due to the delayed examination of the bodies, which had decomposed significantly, left many questions unanswered, especially whether the capsules mentioned in their note were ingested and if they contributed to their deaths. Various theories though have been surfaced over the years to explain the lead masks case. One theory suggests that the men were involved in a scientific experiment, possibly related to UFOs or other paranormal phenomena, as suggested by their interest in electronics and the unusual accessories found at the scene. Another theory suggests that they might have been coerced by a third party into participating in a dangerous activity, leading to their untimely deaths. The UFO enthusiast community has linked the case to extraterrestrial activity, citing the area's reputation for UFO sightings and the strange circumstances of their death. Some locals even reported seeing unidentified aerial phenomena around the time and place where the men died. If these walls could bleed. In 1987, Minnie Clyde Wilson and her husband William Winston lived in a rented brick house in Atlanta, Georgia. The couple had resided there for 22 years. William, 79 years old, suffered from a chronic illness that required daily dialysis, leaving him exhausted by the end of the day. On the night of September 8th, Minnie was relaxing in the bath when she discovered an unusual phenomenon. She found the floors covered in what appeared to be human blood. This blood had seemingly appeared out of nowhere, spreading across the carpets, walls, and rugs. Alarmed, Minnie then woke up her husband, fearing that he might have been injured. However, she quickly realized that William was not bleeding. Together, they checked each room in their 6-room house and found the same mysterious blood in most of them. The couple also had no pets at all, which left them feeling super confused about the source of the blood. They tried to rest, hoping that the problem would resolve itself by the morning, but the blood still remained. They then decided to call the local police, who found a lot of blood in the bathroom, kitchen, living room, bedroom, hallways, and basement. Despite finding no evidence of wrongdoing though, the police treated the house as a crime scene to keep the public away. A sample of the blood was then sent to the Georgia Crime Lab, which confirmed it was human blood, specifically type O. This was strange because Minnie and William both had type A blood. Detective Steve Cartwright, who had been on the force for 10 years, had never seen anything like it. The media then quickly got hold of the story and it ended up becoming a sensation. Psychics offered their services to rid the house of the phenomena, and television stations received numerous calls about the mystery. News footage showed smears, pools, and patterns of blood on the floors and walls, leading to widespread public interest. 5 skeptics in particular, including Dr. Joe Nickel, Larry Johnson, Rick Moen, and Rebecca Long, investigated the case. They visited the Atlanta Police Department's Homicide Division and discussed the case with L.T.H. Walker, who had led the original investigation. The skeptics reviewed police records and saw color photographs of the blood in various rooms. These photographs were mentioned in the electronic newsletter of the Georgia Skeptics but aren't available online. The skeptics found that the blood was indeed type O, and Lieutenant Walker theorized that the blood had been deliberately splattered around the house as a hoax. He suggested that family problems within the Winston family might have motivated such a hoax. The Winstons' daughter, for example, worked in a hospital and could have had access to human blood. Walker believed that the children might have carried out the hoax to have their parents declared legally incompetent. This theory led the Atlanta police to close the investigation to avoid further embarrassment for the family. Rebecca Long experienced a similar situation after investigating the Winstons' case. She found droplets of scarlet liquid running down her bedroom wall. Initially, she considered it might be due to rodents in the attic, but quickly dismissed this. She found that the droplets remained red after drying, unlike blood. Joe Nickel discovered that the liquid was resin melting from her rafters during hot summer days. Long then compared the way the liquid dripped to the photographs of the Winston household and concluded that the liquid in the Winstons' home likely came from an external source rather than the walls themselves. Occult investigator Kurt Rowlett waited 6 months before investigating the case to avoid the initial frenzy. He contacted the Atlanta Police Department and found that the original case detective was no longer there. A spokesperson told him that the case was considered closed due to the incomprehensive nature of the details. Rowlett then contacted Minnie Wilson for an interview. She claimed that the blood was rust and mud mixed with water sprayed into the rooms by steam from a ruptured hot water heater in the basement. However, this explanation was not really viable as there were only 2 floor vents in the house and there was no way for anything inside them to reach the other rooms. The police had determined that the liquid was human blood. Minnie seemed to make this remark to avoid accepting that blood had actually come from her walls, preferring ignorance to the unsettling reality. The case of the bleeding house still remains unexplained though. The police, skeptics, and investigators all reached different conclusions, but none could definitively explain the source of the blood. Mirror Mirror, the death of Jeffrey Desrosiers. So this story revolves around Jeffrey Desrosiers, who was lying in a bed in a small ward in the War Memorial Hospital. It was the evening of February 18th, 1936, and he was recovering from an unspecified injury. 4 other patients also shared the ward with him, including Louis Deschanio and Harvey Davenport. Beside Desrosiers' bed was an enamel table with a plain mirror. The mirror had a mercury back but was otherwise just a silvered piece of glass. Desrosiers then asked Davenport to pass him the mirror so he could comb his hair. As he looked into it, the other patients, having little else to do, simply watched. Suddenly, Desrosiers' expression changed. His eyes grew wide and his face looked pale and sickly. He turned to Davenport and exclaimed, "I'm gonna die, Harvey. I see it in the mirror." He weakly then threw the mirror onto the steel top of the table where it landed near the edge. His last words were, "You won't be able to pick it up." He then froze for a moment before starting to cough, and when the nurse arrived, he died instantly. Davenport then tried to pick up the mirror but found he couldn't. For the next 24 hours, the mirror clung to the table as if it were glued. Hospital attendants, doctors, and various other people tried and failed to remove the mirror from the table. Some even carried the entire table around the ward by holding onto the mirror's lip. Finally, a nurse named Adelaine Knopf used an ice pick to pry the mirror loose, which instantly splintered. Dr. F.G. Moloney, the doctor in charge of the ward, stated that no adhesive or saliva had been used by the dying man. When asked if he thought the curse was supernatural, he dismissed the idea, suggesting the reporter ask if he looked superstitious. Professor Paul Harbret of the University of Detroit later suggested that perspiration from Desrosiers' hand might have chemically reacted with the mirror's mercury backing, causing it to stick to the table. Scientists in Detroit and Ann Arbor speculated that molecular action might be responsible, implying that the mirror and the table were so smooth that they expelled all the air between them, causing the molecules to exert an attractive force. A psychologist, Dr. Albert M. Barrett, suggested mass hypnosis as a cause. However, Harvey Davenport, one of the original witnesses, believed that de Rosier had cast a spell on the mirror. Terrified, Davenport then fled the hospital and left Rexton, Michigan for some place out west. Or men of Sabrevois. In the early hours of July 29, 1976, Miss Bernier, residing in Sabrevois, woke up to attend to one of her children. As she moved through the dark house, she happened to glance out of a window. What she saw was astonishing, being a large white light hovering in the sky. Describing it as a carpet of light, Bernier noted that it was about 50 feet long, 9 feet wide, and 13 inches thick, floating about 2 feet above the ground. From this light, she could see what appeared to be the legs of 2 figures wearing grayish, crumpled trousers. Alarmed and confused by this sight, Bernier went to wake her husband. As she did so, 2 strange entities then appeared in the entranceway. These beings resembled bright globes of light standing on what looked like legs. The entities were possibly the same figure she had seen beneath the craft. Her husband, now awake, observed 2 glowing spheres of brilliant white light, each about 8 inches in diameter, surrounded by red lacework at waist height. The red lacework started to sink into the ground as the entities began to merge into one bright light. The transformation happened quickly, and within just seconds, the entities and the hovering craft vanished, leaving behind an electrical crackling in the air. The details of this encounter are sort of puzzling and difficult to piece together from the differing narratives. During Jape of the Space Ape. On the night of March 22, 1979, motorists traveling north on Sheppey Way were disturbed by an unusual sight. Sheppey Way, the only route between the Isle of Sheppey and mainland Kent in England, saw an encounter that left many questioning reality. Among those travelers was Frank Rosian, who noticed a peculiar entity moving in the darkness on the left side of the road. Rosian, originally from the Netherlands but raised in Britain, was described as intelligent and well-read, with little to no knowledge of UFOs or the silver-suited entities reported across Britain at the time. As he drove along the unlit road surrounded by marshlands and waterlogged fields, he saw what he initially thought was a person struggling down a bank. However, the terrain was difficult, and it was odd that someone would be navigating it in the dark. As he approached, his headlights briefly illuminated the figure, giving him a clearer view. The entity was covered in a one-piece suit and helmet, with a rounded head that had a flattened bottom similar to a tin can. The head appeared small compared to its broad, stocky body, with no visible neck or joining point between the head and the shoulders. Rosian noticed the figure's curious sloping walk and the absence of mud on its legs, despite the swampy conditions. Rosian also included the observation that the entity's suit was not self-luminescent. He believed that the figure was male but could not recall details about the hands or feet. The encounter lasted just only moments, but it was enough to leave a lasting impression on Rosian. Other motorists also reported seeing the strange figure and called the police, although tracking down these witnesses proved kinda difficult. And earlier that evening, at around 9 p.m, a couple driving the opposite way on Sheppey Way had seen a UFO. They described it as a glowing red shape with several white lights revolving around it. The UFO appeared in the direction of Sittingbourne and followed their car almost to London. So yeah, the sighting of this UFO earlier in the evening raises some questions about their potential connection with what he saw that day. The Randolph County Weirdo. Dan Craig and his wife lived on a farm located 4 miles south of Lynn in Randolph County, Indiana. Their farm was typical, but it harbored a strange secret, being a bizarre creature allegedly living in their well. The story begins when Dan Craig spoke to the Indianapolis News, detailing his encounter with a mysterious entity that haunted their well for over a year. The creature, described as having a dome-shaped head, 2 bright eyes, and 8 flailing tentacles as long as a man's arm, brought a sense of unease to the otherwise serene farm. Dan's wife also claimed to have seen the creature, describing it as a mushroom the size of a plate with long legs and feet. These varying descriptions fueled local curiosity, leading Dan to drain the well, leaving only about 4 inches of water at the bottom. In search of the creature, a 12-year-old boy named Craig Lee ventured into the well. He resurfaced, claiming to have seen something that matched the descriptions given by the Craig family, being a grayish-yellow sponge-like mushroom with eyes on top and either 8 or 10 legs ending in pincers. The community was abuzz with speculation, but the excitement soon quelled down by Kenneth Yost, a Randolph County conservation officer. Yost arrived at the farm and dredged a flesh-colored ball of sponge rubber and a section of garden hose from the well. He suggested that these objects had been mistaken for the creature. The reports of the entity then ceased after this discovery, leading many to believe that the case was resolved. However, the explanation left some questions unanswered. Questions like, how could multiple people mistake a rubber ball and hose for a tentacled monster over an extended period? The Craig's family's detailed account seemed too specific to be simple errors. Despite the official conclusion though, the story of the Randolph County weirdo still remains a topic of debate. Some believe that the creature was indeed real and fled due to the attention, while others accept Yost's findings as a logical explanation. The voice of something not human. In Baldwin Hills, Los Angeles, a family had several unnerving encounters during their visits to their grandparents' home. This house, which is located in LA, contained memories of generations, including the upstairs bedroom that still housed the beds of the great-grandparents. The bed that once belonged to the great-grandfather had a stain from the wax he used in his hair, still visible on the headboard. Visitors often felt a presence watching them when they slept in his bed. One day, a person in the family was home alone, taking a shower in the upstairs bathroom. Suddenly though, the smell of old-school pipe tobacco filled the air, though no source for the scent was present. This was sort of reminiscent of the grandfather's habit. And a tradition in the family was to take Polaroid pictures of the table set for Christmas dinner, usually with Sinatra playing in the background. In one such picture, a large white mist appeared floating above the table, an anomaly that couldn't be explained by the family. These small occurrences though simply laid the groundwork for a more chilling experience that would happen to the storyteller at the age of 10. One morning, shortly before Christmas, the child woke up early and went to the kitchen to find something to eat. On the way, they passed their parents' room and noticed it was super dark inside with no sign of the father in his bed. After failing to find him, the child walked back down to the main level of the house towards the kitchen. Passing the front door, they reached the door leading to a long white hallway that went down to the lower level of the house, which included the laundry room, a downstairs apartment, and the door to the outdoor pool. Gathering courage, the child opened the door to the hallway and called out in a high-pitched voice, asking, "Dad, are you down there?" The response they received was terrifying. A powerful, hissing voice that seemed to echo in the child's mind and soul replied with a resounding "No." This voice was not just heard with their ears, but felt throughout their being, instilling a primal fear that the child had never experienced before. In a panic, the child slammed the door and ran back to their room, diving under the covers and staying there for hours. When the father finally entered the room, confused about why the child was not up watching cartoons, they explained what happened. The father, trying to reassure the child, took them downstairs to prove that no one was there. This process was just as terrifying for the child, who was certain of what they had experienced. Despite checking all the closets and spaces, they found no evidence of anyone being there. Years later, when the child was about 17, the father admitted that he had also heard voices and footsteps in the house as a child, but could never understand what the voices were saying. The child's encounter was unique though because of the clarity and intensity of the voice, which sounded nothing like a human voice. The house also had an alarm system that made a loud beep throughout the house whenever anyone entered, ensuring no one else could have been there to play a prank. Technology like baby monitors or walkie-talkies would not have produced the echoing sound or the sense of terror that the child felt. The feeling was so tangible that it could only be understood by someone who had experienced a similar ghostly encounter. The voice, with its unnatural quality, led the child to believe it was something not human, possibly a demon or an angry ghost. The shadowy being. So this story comes from a woman named Rebecca. Basically, when Rebecca was a teenager, she moved with her parents to an older home in eastern North Carolina. The family had lived in the area for a while, so Rebecca remained connected to her friends and school. The house, which was a foreclosure her father bought at a bargain price, needed a lot of work but was still big enough for Rebecca and her siblings to have their own rooms. Soon after moving in, Rebecca made an unexpected discovery. She chose the upstairs bedroom at the front of the house, which had a large walk-in closet that had been part of the main room. The house had undergone several upgrades, causing various parts to seem out of place. One day, while hanging out with her best friend Rachel, Rebecca mentioned the odd construction of her closet. Rachel agreed that it was strange and noted that the room seemed smaller than expected for such a large house. This led Rebecca to suspect that her room might have a hidden space behind the closet wall. Rebecca and Rachel then pushed against the closet wall, which felt flimsy. When they did, they heard a sound from the back corner. Some boards then moved, revealing light from behind. Excited, they removed more boards and discovered a hidden room, just as she expected. Inside, they found an old wooden chair and a lot of candle wax on the floor. Scraping away dirt, they uncovered a large pentagram drawn on the floor, suggesting previous occupants practiced witchcraft in the room. Fascinated by the discovery, Rebecca, Rachel, and a third friend formed a coven and began practicing rituals they found in books on witchcraft. Their practice included attempting to gain psychic powers and influence others. They used tarot cards, a Ouija board, and even made a voodoo doll when a boy at school angered them. As they became more involved, Rebecca and Rachel felt like someone else was in the hidden room with them. Rebecca began seeing shadowy figures moving around the room, which didn't respond to changes in candlelight. One night, after performing a ritual, Rebecca saw the shadowy figures in her bedroom emerging from the closet. This continued nightly, causing her to wake up with the figures standing around her bed. She tried various protection techniques, but nothing seemed to work. Rebecca described the shadow beings as small, about 4 feet tall, with glowing red eyes. They appeared in groups of 3 to 5, but she sensed more hiding in the darkness or closet. These encounters made it difficult for her to sleep, leading her to sleep on the couch, where she still ended up seeing the shadowy figures. Rebecca then believed her dabbling in the occult had allowed these beings to enter. She thought that they were spirits of the deceased trying to make contact. Despite these unsettling encounters though, she still continued practicing witchcraft. After high school, she moved in with a boyfriend who also practiced witchcraft, and they both reported frequent visits from these shadowy beings. They now believe these beings are interdimensional, not human, and that they can't fully manifest without receiving energy. Rebecca feels responsible for keeping the shadowy beings in check, believing it's her duty to prevent these from disturbing others. Lights of Assawompset Pond. Over the years, many people have reported sightings of mysterious lights around Assawompset Pond. These beings are said to be the size of baseballs or even larger, moving like fireflies at night. They sometimes dive into the water, vanish briefly, and then reappear suddenly. Some believe these lights are teipawankas, orbs of light controlled by pukwudgies, which are used to lure people to their deaths. Joe, a local resident, decided to take a few people to the lake to see if they could spot these floating lights. What they encountered though was far more unsettling than what they had expected. Joe and his companions arrived at the lake in late spring, a time when the weather was pleasant. They arrived late in the day, planning to wait until nightfall to see the lights. Joe's girlfriend and her cousin Chad accompanied him. Chad claimed to have seen the lights when he was young, but Joe was skeptical but still curious. As the sun began to set, their anticipation grew. They still had about half an hour before it would be dark enough for the lights to appear. Joe started feeling uneasy, sensing that someone was watching them. He couldn't relax and was sitting down and then getting back up to pace around. His girlfriend was annoyed by his restlessness, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. 10 minutes passed and Joe continued to feel anxious. While walking around a small clearing, he thought he saw something move out of the corner of his eye. This made him even more nervous, and he saw it again, this time clearly. It was a small figure about 3 feet tall, peering out from a tree. Joe only saw it from the waist up, but the sight was enough to completely terrify him. The figure had wild hair sticking out in all directions, a big nose, large ears, and a big mouth. Its expression was angry, as if it was upset that Joe had seen it. Unable to control his fear, Joe then let out a scream, which only seemed to anger the figure more. The figure scowled at Joe, who then turned and ran. He passed his girlfriend and Chad, shouting that he was leaving, and ran straight to his car. He didn't know if they were following him, but he wasn't willing to wait and see. Joe then started the car just as his companions jumped in, spooked by his panic. Once they were safely away, Joe explained what he had seen. Chad told him that he had encountered a pukwudgie, a creature that brings bad luck. Joe's skepticism then turned into belief as a series of unfortunate events followed. He split with his girlfriend and soon after had to move because his apartment building was sold. The experience left Joe determined never to return to the pond or see another pukwudgie again. North Carolina Grinning Man. In the 1980s, a man encountered a figure known as the Carolina Grinning Man in rural North Carolina. This took place during a drive with his friend Tom. They were exploring back roads, something that they did often. Tom joked that strange things happened when they spent time together, and that day proved him right. As they drove along a winding road lined with trees, they noticed a figure standing by the road. It was late summer and the evenings were warm. The figure wore a long coat and a hat, which seemed out of place for the weather. The man pointed this out to Tom, who also saw the figure and was transfixed. As they approached, it felt like the car was suddenly slowing down, though neither could remember if Tom had actually lifted his foot off the gas pedal or if something else was at play. The figure then became clearer as they got closer. He wore an old-fashioned coat and a formal hat, something like a top hat but not as tall. His right hand, gloved, was held under his chin as if he was rubbing his fingers together. His left arm hung behind his back. The ensemble looked Victorian, but under the coat was a large shiny belt. The strangest part though was his expression, being a wide leering grin that seemed too large for his face, reminiscent of the Joker. Everything seemed to move in slow motion as they passed the figure. His gaze then followed them, and they nearly came to a stop. The man felt a chill, sensing that crossed paths with something unnatural and otherworldly. He turned to look through the back window and then saw the same figure standing in the road, now staring at their car in their direction. It seemed impossible that the figure had moved so quickly. Tom, looking in the rearview mirror, was pale and wide-eyed. The man saw the figure still grinning as they rounded another curve and lost sight of him. The car then sped up and the man asked Tom to stop and go back. Tom resisted, calling him crazy and suggesting the figure was a psycho inspired by horror movies. The man insisted though, feeling that the figure was unnatural and wanting another look. After a debate, Tom reluctantly turned the car around and they headed back to the bend in the road. They saw nothing ahead and stopped the car. The man then jumped out despite Tom's protests and searched the area. He found no signs of a vehicle or hidden driveways. The road had a deep ditch close by and a tree line on the other side, leaving little room for anyone to stand. He finally found the spot where the figure had been, but saw no footprints. However, the grass looked recently disturbed. There was a strange electrical smell in the area as well, like a burning transformer, though there were no power lines nearby. Tom, impatient, yelled for him to get back in the car. After one last look, the man complied, and they sped off. Tom believed the incident confirmed his theory about strange things happening around his friend. The man, however, was left wondering about the figure they had seen. Later that night, two unusual events added to the mystery. Tom called to report that his neighbor's house had been struck by lightning and caught fire. No one was injured, and the fire department quickly extinguished the flames. The man, though, was reminded of the electrical smell near the grinning man. Then, another friend called to report that his sister and mother had seen a UFO about 5 miles from Tom's house. The sighting occurred around the same time as the lightning strike. Despite heavy rain, the man drove to the location, hoping for more anomalies but found nothing. The next day, he asked around and found that another couple had also seen strange lights in the sky the previous night. The lights were described as bright and low in the sky, changing from white to amber, then blue-white and back to white. The man returned to the location of the sighting multiple times, driven by curiosity. He asked around discreetly but found no further information. The nearest house was miles away, and he couldn't just ask random people about strange sightings. The mystery of the grinning man, though, still remains unsolved. The figure appeared and simply vanished without a trace, leaving the man with more questions than answers. At the time, there was little information about grinning men. Some believed the figure was an alien, a cryptid, or a ghost. A contactee also suggested he was a friendly space brother, but the man felt no friendliness from the figure he saw. Uranus, planet of the giants. In July of 1947, a group of surveyors working near Bauru in the Brazilian state of Sao Paulo encountered a situation that would become a hallmark in UFO lore. Basically, as they conducted their work in the countryside, they heard a loud whistling noise that drew their attention to the sky. To their astonishment, they saw a saucer-shaped craft descending rapidly towards the ground. Overwhelmed by fear, all but one surveyor, Jose C. Higgins, fled the scene. Higgins, a topographer by profession, stayed behind to witness the extraordinary event unfold. Higgins described the craft as a lens-shaped object about 150 feet in diameter with a 3-foot rim and a height of about 15 feet. The body of the craft was crisscrossed with tubes from which the whistling sound emanated. The UFO then landed roughly 150 feet away from Higgins, supported by 4 metallic struts that appeared to bend slightly under its weight. Then curiosity overtook his initial fear as Higgins approached the craft. He noticed a black glass window behind which 2 humanoid shapes were visible, observing him. A door then opened beneath the rim of the object, and 3 entities began emerging. These beings were about 7 feet tall, covered in inflated transparent suits that resembled plastic bags, with metal boxes affixed to their backs. Beneath these bubble-like spacesuits, the creature wore colorful shirts and shorts that seemed to be made of paper rather than cloth. They had large round eyes, no eyebrows or hair, and their legs were disproportionately larger than those of a human. Higgins could not determine their gender, but noted a certain aesthetic appeal to their appearance. The entities communicated among themselves in an unfamiliar language and seemed to avoid direct sunlight, preferring to stay in the shade. One of them then pointed a tube-shaped object at Higgins and motioned for him to enter the craft. Through the open door, Higgins could see another inner door and the end of a corridor-like pipe. Attempting to learn more about his mysterious visitors, Higgins used gestures to ask where they came from. In response, one of the beings drew a diagram on the ground showing a dot surrounded by 7 circles, indicating that the dot represented the sun, which they called Alamo in their language. They pointed to the 7th circle, which presumably represented Uranus, and named Orca. Through their gestures, they conveyed that they had traveled from Uranus. Fearing that the entities might try to take him to their planet, Higgins then devised a ploy to avoid abduction. He showed them a picture of his wife and indicated that he did not want to leave her or wish to take her along. The giants seemed to understand and allowed him to leave. He then retreated into the forest and watched from a distance as the entities engaged in playful activities, such as jumping in the air and throwing large stones. After about half an hour of this display, the entities then re-entered their craft. The UFO took off with its characteristic whistling sound, and the giants were never seen again. Reflecting on the incident, Higgins admitted that he sometimes doubted the reality of what he experienced, despite the presence of other surveyors at the beginning of the event. Red-eyed creature says psst. In Olmito, Texas, a young boy experienced an unsettling encounter one night when his brother-in-law asked him to go to a nearby store to get nachos around 10 p.m. The store was about a 5-minute walk from his house, but the journey was daunting because it was pitch dark. Only a few homes in the area could afford light posts, and across the area from his house there was a dense forest along the dirt road leading to the main road. The store was basically the only place with a light post, and the houses provided just enough light to navigate back home. After picking up the nachos, he started heading home. Away from the store's light though, he suddenly heard a psst sound. He stopped and turned around, seeing nothing. He continued walking but heard the sound again. Thinking it might be his brother-in-law trying to scare him, he shouted back, telling it to stop. Fear then began to creep in though as the sounds persisted in the darkness. As he walked faster, he heard a low growl and the sound of hoof-like steps following him. He wanted to run but was afraid of falling in the dark. He couldn't help but notice though that the hoof-like steps seemed to be matching his pace. Mustering the courage to turn around, he then saw the horrifying sight, being a large black creature resembling a dog but with hooves. Its hair appeared coarse like that of a pig, and it had big red glowing eyes. The creature then showed its teeth and fangs, growling low as if it were about to attack. Every step he took, the creature mirrored, and he could hear the hooves stomp on the dirt road with each step. The red glowing eyes sent chills down his spine, and the growl seemed to echo in the dark. He then walked backward, keeping his eye on the creature to prevent it from attacking. As he neared his house, the creature disappeared like smoke. Running inside, he found his family and told them what happened. His mom dismissed the story, either not believing him or too scared to accept it. His brother-in-law, however, grabbed his gun and went outside to check. Though he saw nothing, he heard the same sound and some evil laughter, which gave him goosebumps. Now as an adult, he still gets those goosebumps, remembering those red glowing eyes and the low growl. When he visits his father, who still lives in the area, his father insists he not go alone at night. Is it food time? Chuck, who lives west of Dallas, Texas, had an eerie encounter with a black-eyed kid in his front yard in April 2012. After a quick trip to the shore, Chuck returned home in the early evening with 2 bags of groceries. As he opened the front door, he heard someone speak to his right. Startled, he turned and saw a boy standing beside the steps in his yard. The boy wore a gray hoodie with the hood up and jeans. The boy then asked, "Is it food time?" which puzzled Chuck. Before Chuck could respond, the boy spoke again, "It's food time, you should invite me in." Chuck was confused and wary as he didn't recognize the boy and knew all his neighbors. At that moment, Chuck heard his pit bull barking and running through the house towards the front door. The dog, normally fearless and obedient, slid across the wooden floor and almost fell over itself trying to stop. It went from attack mode to fear, tucking its tail, lowering its head, and running away whining. Chuck had never seen his dog act this way, and it was scaring him. Chuck then noticed the boy's eyes, being that they were solid black with no whites. This sight, combined with the dog's reaction, caused him to quickly go inside and slam the door shut. Shaken, he put the grocery bags down in the kitchen. When he looked through the blinds, the boy was gone. Chuck then checked around the house but found no sign of him. His wife was concerned about the dog, which had hidden under the bed and refused to come out. For several days, the dog stayed mostly under the bed, only going outside through the back door when necessary. It took weeks for the dog's behavior to return to normal, but Chuck felt the dog never fully recovered from the fear it experienced that evening. Chuck described the boy as about 14 years old. He asked his neighbors if they had seen any strangers, but no one had noticed anything unusual. Chuck's yard is open and clear, with the nearest tree at the front of his property, so there was nothing for the boy to hide behind. The sudden appearance of the boy baffled Chuck. Canines can also sense fear in people and other animals. In this case, the dog seemed to sense danger from the boy, which terrified it. Many who encounter black-eyed children report feeling as if they're being overlooked by a predator. Chuck couldn't determine how close his dog got to the boy before its fear reaction kicked in. It all happened quickly, and the dog tried to stop as it reached the front door. Despite the dog's training though, it couldn't overcome the fear it felt, suggesting that the boy projected an overwhelming energy. The encounter overall left Chuck feeling haunted, unable to explain why he and his dog sensed such fear from a teenage boy. Little Green Men and Three Blind Mice. One February night in 1948, two witnesses in the Tasmanian town of Berrydale encountered something extraordinary. Basically, around midnight while standing in their back garden, they noticed a bright object hovering low in the sky above them. This saucer-shaped object was not just a simple light, but had several diminutive green humanoids perched on its edge. These entities were not silent observers, but were making an odd singing sound, which some sources suggest was to the tune of Three Blind Mice, which is a children's song. The sight of these childlike entities apparently mocking the witnesses with their song was pretty surreal. The bright object and its occupants did not linger though. After their performance, the saucer slowly drifted westward, disappearing from view. This event, unlike anything the witnesses had ever experienced before, was not easy to be forgotten. Albert Rosales, a researcher informed about this case by Tasmanian UFO researcher Keith Roberts, brought this event to light. Rosales published a description of this encounter on his website before it was transferred to book format. Further research into this case reveals that it remains obscure, with limited information available beyond the initial reports. Lumbering Leviathan of Lake Campbell. In 1934, a farmer living near Lake Campbell in eastern South Dakota was troubled by a series of livestock disappearances. One day, as he drove his tractor along a road near the lake, he encountered an enormous four-legged reptile that appeared out of nowhere. The sudden appearance of this massive creature caused the farmer to swerve his tractor off the road and into a nearby ditch to avoid a collision. The reptile then quickly vanished, moving toward the lake. Confused by what he had just seen, the farmer then returned to the area with some helpers. Together, they found a trail of large four-legged footprints in a nearby muddy field leading toward Lake Campbell. These footprints were unidentifiable and seemed to confirm the presence of a mysterious creature. However, this is where the available information about the incident ends, as no further sightings or evidence were reported. The story, though brief, has been mentioned in sources like Mysterious Universe and David Pratt's book, Visitors from the Twilight Zone. Some suggest that the tale might have been a publicity stunt for the nearby wall drug known for its mechanical T-Rex head. Others believe it might have been a newspaper hoax. Abduction at Risor. In August 2009, a man experienced a terrifying encounter in the Norwegian forest near Risor. Basically, while walking in the woods around midday, he noticed two small lights floating in front of him. Intrigued, he approached the lights, getting within about 10 feet of them. The lights then began swirling faster and faster until a black hole appeared. From this portal, a glowing sphere with legs emerged and started moving towards him. Frightened, the man tried to run and hide in the woods, but the sphere seemed to move effortlessly through the trees, ignoring any obstacles in its path. Feeling desperate, he decided to confront the object. When he grabbed it, he felt a strange electric and vibrating shock that threw him backward into the air, landing him in a nearby farm field. As he lay there, he felt as if he were sinking into the ground and heard a voice speaking in what he believed could be either Hebrew or Arabic. He then screamed for help and turned to see a white male figure standing about 8 feet tall. In shock, he noticed 3 more orbs had appeared by his side. From these orbs emerged gray humanoids who appeared to be angry. The tall white humanoid pointed towards the woods and seemed to command the small grays to roll away. The man doesn't provide further details about his experience, but claims he was with these entities for about 8 hours. Banshee in the Blackrock. The tale of the Banshee is part of Irish folklore and represents a ghostly figure whose wails are said to herald death. These stories, while often considered myth, have been backed by numerous accounts from witnesses who claim to have experienced the presence of this entity. One such account from Blackrock near Cork involves a young girl who witnessed the Banshee and the tragic events that followed. Basically, a young girl was standing at the window of her home in Blackrock when she saw a white figure standing on a nearby bridge. The figure waved its arms towards the house, and the girl heard the wailing cries of the Banshee. The wailing lasted just several seconds before the figure just vanished. The next morning, her grandfather, while walking into the city of Cork, fell and hit his head against a curb. He never regained consciousness. Years later, in March 1900, the same woman, now much older and very ill, experienced another encounter with a banshee. One evening, as a nurse and relative were arranging her bed, they heard a strange wailing sound that seemed to emanate from around and under the bed. They then searched for the source of the noise but found nothing. Interestingly, the woman herself did not hear the sound, though her sister, who was downstairs with her father, did. The sister then rushed upstairs, fearing something had happened to her child, but found him sleeping peacefully. In the house next door, the neighbors also heard the wailing and ran downstairs, thinking something had happened to their servant. The servant, however, immediately identified the sound as a banshee's cry and remarked that it meant the woman next door was dying. Another interesting incident related to the banshee occurred at a public school. In this one, a boy who had fallen ill was placed in a room by himself. One day, while being visited by the doctor, the boy suddenly claimed to hear someone crying. The doctor, who heard nothing, assumed the illness had affected the boy's mind. However, the boy insisted that he heard the banshee, having encountered it before. The following morning, the headmaster received a telegram informing him that the boy's brother had been accidentally shot dead. Maria got used to witches flying overhead. So this story is about Maria, who has lived in Donna, Texas since she was small. Starting around the age of 8 or 10, she began to notice witches flying around her house. This unusual occurrence became so regular that she ended up getting used to it, seeing these witches every full moon or every other day. Over time, the sightings became less frequent until she was about 14 years old. One morning, while waiting for the exceptionally early school bus at around 4 a.m., Maria and her neighbors witnessed something extraordinary. There was a large tree in front of her house, and the neighbors often gathered there. On this particular day, though, they all started screaming and running back home, having seen something flying out of a tree that they described as something straight out of a movie. This sighting was so terrifying that, for a while, no one waited outside anymore. Another significant sighting happened when Maria was 16. Her mother had asked her to bring in the clothes hanging outside. Suddenly, though, the lights flickered on and off, and Maria looked up to see a witch flying above her. The witch was looking down on her, causing Maria to feel a wave of terror. Despite these experiences, though, Maria still lives in the same house. The presence of witches had subsided for a while, but recently began making itself known again. Bloodthirsty beast of Bowland Forest. In the thick, shadowy expanse of the trough of Bowland Forest, a young girl experienced an encounter that has haunted her for years. Even as she now leads a paranormal investigation team out of Bolton, Lancashire, she can't forget the terrifying sight that she witnessed as a child. Her father often took her and her siblings there to play, allowing them to explore and run riot amidst the trees. On this particular day, though, she wandered off alone, not realizing how deep she had ventured into the woods. As she moved further into the wilderness, a sense of unease grew within her. The familiar sounds of her siblings' laughter and the rustlings of leaves underfoot faded away. It was then that she noticed something peculiar, being a large dark figure crouching behind a nearby tree. At first, it was difficult to make out, but as she inched closer, the details became clearer. Massive arms wrapped around the tree trunk and a head tilted slightly to watch her every move. The creature's long, matted hair, black and brown in color, and its snout and pointed ears became apparent as she approached. Her father had often let her watch episodes of Strange But True, a show that featured various unexplained phenomena. These stories had sparked her imagination, and now facing this creature, she immediately thought of werewolves. The creature remained motionless, with its eyes fixed on her as she cautiously circled around it. It was an unnerving sight, and she could feel fear building inside her. Panic then set in, and she decided to run back the way she came. Sprinting towards the light filtering through the trees at the forest's edge, she glanced over her shoulder to see if the creature was following her. In her haste, she failed to notice a tree directly in her path and collided with it head first. Blood then poured down her face, and she was momentarily dazed by the impact. Despite the pain and confusion, she continued to run, desperate to find her father. When she finally reached him, the wounds on her head were severe and took weeks to heal. She described the creature to her father, but there were no other witnesses, and the area was deserted. The experience left her terrified as she couldn't comprehend what she had seen. Researcher Deborah Hatswell though later noted that there have been also other reports of Bigfoot and dogman-type creatures in the bowland forest area. Crocodile aliens. In 1967, a strange alien abduction case emerged in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, involving a young man named David Seawald. David, 14 years old at the time, had an encounter with the flying saucer piloted by crocodile-skinned aliens. Basically, on November 17, 1967, after a day of high school, David went to his friend Matt's house a few blocks from his own. They had a routine of lifting weights, emulating the pro wrestlers they watched on television. Knowing his parents wouldn't be home until 5:30, David and Matt had over an hour to lift weights. They had finished their routines around 5:45 and David headed home. The weather was cold, so David decided to take a shortcut across the field. As he walked though, he heard a humming sound, initially thinking it was a swarm of bees. Looking around, he then saw a large silver disc-shaped craft with flashing colored lights on its upper dome. The ship moved quickly through the sky, then swooped down toward him, hovering 30 to 40 feet above the ground. At around 6:30, David rushed into his house, almost colliding with his older sister Angela as he darted up the stairs to his bedroom. Angela then followed him, finding him crouching on the floor, trying to hide under his bed. He was in a panic, wearing only one shoe and nervously peering out the window. Angela asked what was wrong, but David could only stutter about a flying saucer chasing him from Matt's house. Angela, puzzled by his behavior, pointed out that he was late and asked why. David explained that he had left Matt's house at 5:45, but had no memory of what happened after the saucer approached him. David's missing shoe was later found outside, likely lost in his frantic run home. Angela realized her brother had experienced something truly strange and urged him to tell their parents. The Seawalds were unsure how to handle the situation, knowing their son wasn't prone to making up stories, but this was beyond anything they'd encountered. David's sighting and his loss of time were only the beginning though. In the days following his encounter, David's behavior changed. Normally calm and good-natured, he became nervous, constantly looking around as if being followed. He jumped at sudden noises and movements, experiencing dizziness and disorientation. His family was at a loss until they heard a radio program by UFO investigator W.K. Bill Allen, who visited the Seawald home. After interviewing David extensively, Allen left, and the family felt some relief, though it only lasted 5 months. In April, David had a horrible dream, thrashing about and moaning loudly. When a family member woke him, he quickly stated he remembered what had happened. He described monsters taking him aboard the flying saucer. Bill Allen was then called back and suggested a series of hypnotic regressions to help David recover his lost memories. Allen then enlisted Dr. Campbell, a dentist experienced in hypnosis, to assist. Campbell, with Allen present, guided David into a hypnotic state, taking him back to the night of November 17, 1967. David recalled seeing the saucer in the field, but his legs began shaking violently and fear racked his body. Subsequent sessions led to the same results, being that David became immobilized with fear at the sight of the saucer. Dr. Campbell then decided to change his approach, suggesting that David view the incident as if watching it on television. With this new method, David was able to answer questions about what happened in the field. He described a large silver saucer with colored lights. An orange beam then shot out from the bottom of the craft, hitting him and causing him to feel like he was in a trance. He was then pulled into the saucer by the beam. Inside the craft, David saw monsters with eyes on the sides of their heads and holes where the ears and nose should be. They had rough brown skin like a crocodile and were about the size of David's father. The aliens placed David on a cot, undressed him, and took him to another room with bright lights on the ceiling. There, he was placed on an examination table where the aliens worked around him, making buzzing noises. They lifted his head, looked at his hair, eyes, and nose, and placed a grayish cloth around him. An orange light then shone on him, and one alien stuck a small gray needle in his arm. After the examination, the aliens dressed David, wheeled him to another part of the ship, and placed him in the orange beam of light, which transported him back to the field. David then ran home in a panic with his memories of the incident lost until the dreams and hypnosis sessions revealed his experience with the crocodile aliens. Behind the blinds in suburbia. Charlene from Florida shared an experience that happened in her suburban neighborhood. The area had many rental properties, and the house next door to Charlene's was empty for a long time until a couple named Chad and Beth had moved in. They had no kids, which was unusual for the area. Charlene and her husband talked to Chad and Beth often since they lived right next door. Chad and Beth never talked about their jobs in detail, only mentioning that they worked from home on the computer. They seemed nice and normal at first, but strange things started to happen after about 6 months. One day, Charlene and her husband invited Chad and Beth to a cookout. At the cookout, Charlene noticed that Chad and Beth stayed far away from the grill, avoiding the fire even after the grill was closed. Shortly after this, Beth started visiting Charlene during the day while her husband was at work. Beth would look around the house constantly, examining everything, which made Charlene uncomfortable. Beth wasn't much for conversation, and her visits seemed pointless. Charlene also mentioned it to her husband, who thought Beth was just bored and wanted company. After a week of these visits, Charlene didn't see Beth for a few days. That weekend, Charlene brought her mother's cat to their house while her mother was on vacation. The next day, Beth came over for one of her visits, sitting in the same kitchen chair she always chose. 10 minutes though after Beth arrived, the cat came out of the bedroom, saw Beth, and went crazy. The cat's hair stood up and it hissed loudly. Beth then leaned forward and glared at the cat with a nasty look. The cat ran back to the bedroom, and Beth stood up and left without saying a word. Reflecting back, Charlene found the whole situation strange. When Charlene's husband came home, she told him what had happened. They then decided to visit Chad and Beth. When they knocked on their door, they started hearing strange noises inside, like something being thrown against the wall. Suddenly, the door opened and Chad and Beth stood there as if everything was normal. They didn't invite Charlene and her husband inside, but just stood side by side. Charlene asked Beth if she was afraid of cats. Chad shot Beth an angry look, and Beth became very nervous, saying nothing. It was an awkward moment. Then Charlene saw Beth's eyes change from normal blue to solid black. Charlene's jaw dropped and her husband pulled her arm, rushing back to their house. Inside, Charlene asked her husband if he had seen Beth's eyes change. He confirmed he also had, and he also saw Chad's eyes change to solid black. Both of them felt an overwhelming need to run away. The next day, Charlene and her husband noticed that Chad or Beth were often looking at them from behind their blinds. A week later, Chad and Beth moved out, but no one saw them move. Charlene discovered that no one in the neighborhood had seen the couple move in either. They had just appeared, acting as if they had always lived there. In a normal suburban community, this made no sense. While people move in and out of houses regularly, it usually involves packing and moving trucks. Disappearing in the middle of the night suggested something criminal, but there was no evidence of illegal activity. Other neighbors had noticed strange behavior from Chad and Beth as well, but hadn't seen their eyes change color. Charlene and her husband were left with an unsettling mystery. The cat's reaction, the strange behavior, and the change in Beth and Chad's eyes haunted them. Charlene couldn't shake the feeling that Chad and Beth weren't human. Halfway there. A woman named Justine had a strange experience while traveling in Colorado, leading her to believe she encountered an alien-human hybrid. New to the study of UFOs, Justine was still grappling with the vast scope of the field and its diverse theories. She was introduced to this world suddenly when she learned that her sister Catherine was an abductee. Justine had not seen Catherine for over 3 years, and when they reconnected in the spring of 2012, Catherine revealed her involvement with UFOs, aliens, and abductions. Their parents had separated when they were teenagers, making them closer to each other but not their parents. This bond made it hard for Justine when Catherine disappeared without much explanation. Over time, the pain of not knowing turned into a focus on her own life, pushing thoughts of her sister to the back of her mind. In early 2012, Catherine contacted Justine, inviting her to visit in Colorado. It took a couple of months, but by spring, Justine was on her way. The reunion was both comfortable and tense, with years of emotions resurfacing. They talked late into the night, reminiscing and catching up. When Justine pressed Catherine about her absence, Catherine delayed the conversation until the next day. On Friday night, Catherine dropped the bombshell, "Justine, I'm an abductee." At first, Justine didn't understand. She thought Catherine meant she had been abducted by people or a cult. It took a long conversation to understand that Catherine was talking about being abducted by aliens. Justine had no interest in UFOs and struggled to comprehend her sister's seriousness. Catherine had moved to Colorado to focus on herself and her experiences, which had been going on for many years. Memories of the abduction started coming back, compelling her to withdraw and try to understand them. They spent the rest of the weekend discussing Catherine's experiences, and Justine left with books to read, still unsure of what to believe. Driving home, Justine's mind was racing with thoughts about her sister's revelations. She stopped at a gas station to refuel and grab a drink. Distracted, she started pumping gas when she noticed a young girl standing near her car. The girl in a cream-colored dress stared at Justine with startling blue eyes that seemed oversized due to large pupils. The girl's skin was extremely pale, and Justine greeted her, but the girl responded with, "We're halfway there." Confused, Justine asked for clarification. The girl said, "Your sister Catherine will understand. It's for all of us," sending chills down Justine's spine. Justine let go of the gas nozzle and walked toward the girl, but a sudden fear made her step back. She returned the nozzle to the pump and opened her car door. The girl simply repeated, "We're halfway there." At that moment, an older man in a pickup truck pulled up at the adjacent pump. Justine called out to him, hoping he would see the girl. When he glanced back, the girl was gone. The man hadn't seen her, and Justine, shaken, apologized and drove away. Once calmer, Justine called Catherine and recounted the encounter. Catherine told her she had seen a hybrid. During the weekend, Catherine had mentioned alien-human hybrids, but Justine had focused on accepting the idea of her sister being abducted. The concept of hybrids was too far-fetched. The girl's words "were halfway there" stuck in her mind, making her wonder about their meaning. It seems to involve more than just Catherine and her, hinting at something broader. Justine and Catherine discussed it often, but found no answers. In the months following, Justine and Catherine spent more time together. Justine began to open up about strange memories involving bright lights, large jackrabbits, and missing time. Catherine believed both had been abducted since childhood. She had distanced herself to understand her experiences without dragging Justine into them. However, as more memories surfaced, Catherine realized their shared experiences. BAK on the balcony. Sandra's encounter with the black-eyed kid in her Miami apartment is an account of a seemingly normal day that turned into a haunting experience. It all started when she was living in a secure, gated complex in a third-floor executive apartment provided by her company. The apartment was comfortable with one bedroom full of furnishings and a balcony off the living room. Sandra had settled in over several months and felt secure despite her long work hours that often had her coming home late, grabbing a quick bite and taking a short nap before continuing her work on the computer. One Thursday afternoon, exhausted from her demanding schedule, Sandra returned to her apartment and fell asleep on the couch. She woke up abruptly after about 2 hours, sensing something unusual. Initially disoriented, she heard a noise and realized it was knocking. As she sat up, she noticed the knocking sounded strange, as if it were coming from behind her. Her front door was in front of her, so she turned to look at the glass doors leading to the balcony. Standing at the balcony door was a boy about 12 or 13 years old. His face was pale and his eyes were solid black. He was knocking on the glass and staring darkly at her. The sight terrified Sandra, causing her to run to the bedroom and call building security. The security guard arrived quickly and knocked on her front door, announcing himself. Sandra, still shaken, let him in and explained what had happened, omitting the detail about the boy's black eyes. The security officer then checked the balcony and the surrounding area, but found no one. He seemed skeptical, noting that it was unlikely anyone could have climbed down from the third floor so quickly without being seen. Despite his reassurances though, Sandra couldn't shake the fear and the disturbing image of the boy with black eyes. She wondered how he had reached her balcony and why he was there. These questions haunted her, and she avoided spending much time in the apartment after the incident. Months later, her sister told her about black-eyed kids, and Sandra became convinced that this was what she had encountered. She ended up consulting a physician to ensure there was no health issue contributing to the experience and received a clean bill of health. Despite attempts to rationalize the incident, Sandra remains convinced that the boy was a real physical being. Step-grandfather encounter. So this story comes from a Reddit user named Archaic about their step-grandfather. Basically, growing up in a challenging environment shuffled between various homes and orphanages alongside his numerous siblings, he had a life marked by hardship and uncertainty. Despite these struggles though, he usually recounted lighthearted tales to his young granddaughter, offering a sense of warmth and escapism. However, one narrative stood apart from the rest. When he was about 10 years old, staying in one of the orphanages, he encountered a night that would linger in his memory. It was late at night, a time when the world seemed to slow down and the quiet enveloped the orphanage. He found himself struggling to fall asleep, the day's events perhaps swirling in his mind. But when sleep finally took hold, it brought with it a surreal experience, being an out-of-body journey that transcended the ordinary boundaries of dreaming. He vividly described observing himself from above, as if his consciousness had momentarily left his body and floated above, looking down at his own sleeping form from the perspective of someone or something much taller. This extraordinary vision was abruptly interrupted when he awoke to a startling sight. Standing around his bed, which was positioned with only the back end against the wall, were about 5 towering shadowy figures. These beings were enveloped in darkness so profound that their faces remained hidden, obscured from view. Despite the potential for fear in such a moment, he felt a surprising calm wash over him, being that there was no sense of danger from these figures. He simply closed his eyes once more and slipped back into sleep, waking the next morning as if it was all a fleeting shadow of the night. He then shared this story only once, leaving a trail of unspoken thoughts in its wake. The quiet that followed his telling was heavy with implication, suggesting that these figures might not have been mere figments of a dream, but perhaps visitors from an otherworldly origin. As a child, Archaic might have misunderstood the gravity of what was being suggested, interpreting the tale through a lens of fear and concern for harm. But reflecting back, it seems clear that the step-grandfather did not perceive these visitors as malevolent. The narrative remains a solitary testament though to an unusual encounter, unverified beyond his own recollection but still deeply significant to him. It was a rare glimpse into the profound and personal mysteries that he carried with him, a story that diverged from his usual cheerful reminiscences. Slaughter at the Zoo. In the spring of 1992, John Downes, the director of the British-based Centre for Fortean Zoology, was in conversation with a police officer from Middlemore Police Station in Exeter. They discussed the frequent sightings of big cats reported in Devon and Cornwall. The officer mentioned a series of bizarre animal mutilations at New Quay Zoo in the late 1970s, which Downes was unaware of. The officer connected Downes with the head keeper at the zoo during that period, who provided more details. The elderly zookeeper confirmed that several animals, including wallabies, swans, and geese, had been beheaded and drained of blood. He mentioned consulting a UFO investigator who suggested extraterrestrial involvement, theorizing that the beings needed the blood for survival. However, the zookeeper leaned more towards theories of black magic and witch covens. There were also rumors of big cats in the area, supported by the discovery of large paw prints. The conversation ended, but Downes felt there was more to uncover. Unfortunately though, the zookeeper died 2 days later, leaving many questions unanswered. Then, in 1994, Downes received a package of documents, including a police file on the 1978 animal killings at New Quay Zoo. The first report from October 2, 1978 mentioned several incidents initially thought to be caused by a marauding animal, a theory later dismissed. The most bizarre report though detailed an attempt to enter the lion's cage, indicating either extreme foolhardiness or near indestructibility of the intruder. Prints found outside the cage suggested a large cat, but the sophisticated method of killing pointed to a high level of intelligence. The police file noted that the method of killing indicated an extremely strong person or the use of a drug to pacify the animals. The file also mentioned the need for tissue samples to detect any drugs used. Despite the detailed investigation though, the mysterious deaths remained unsolved. Downes later accessed additional documents, raising further questions about mysterious disappearances and local livestock losses during the relevant period. These documents speculated whether an old abandoned mine near the zoo served as a refuge for the culprit. The case of the animal killings at Newquay Zoo, though, remains a mystery and is left to speculate whether something otherworldly was at hand. Gravedigger's ghost. Mark started digging graves in the 1960s with his father. Over the decades, he's dug countless graves all by hand. Even though it's become common to use machinery, Mark has continued with the traditional method, believing that those who passed on deserved their final resting place to be in ground that a man had worked on personally. Now, in his 70s, he admits the work has become much harder, with the ground feeling tougher and the rocks heavier. Despite this though, he persists, driven by a deep sense of respect for the deceased. The last grave Mark dug though was for one of his oldest friends. It took him nearly an entire day to complete, and by the end he felt utterly exhausted, almost wishing to lie down in it himself. Despite the physical toll though, he found solace in the solitude and honesty of his work. People often asked if he ever got scared being alone in the cemetery, especially when he was down in the graves, but for the longest time he never did. He believed that when people die, their souls move on to heaven, leaving nothing behind to be afraid of. However, this belief was challenged in 2014. Mark was digging a grave for an elderly woman who had moved to New York to live with her daughter but wanted to be buried beside her husband back in their hometown. About 3/4 through their digging, he heard a woman singing nearby. He stopped his work and looked around but saw no one. The singing continued though, an old hymn that sounded both familiar and haunting. Trying to pinpoint the source of the voice, Mark felt as though it was coming from everywhere at once. It was as if speakers were hidden around him, playing the tune. Intrigued and slightly unsettled, he got out of the grave to investigate further. As he walked toward the source of the singing, he saw a white mist in the general shape of a person, floating a few feet off the ground about 20 feet away. He wiped his eyes, thinking his vision was blurry, but the mist remained clear and distinct. The closer Mark got, the louder the singing became, filling the air like a church solo. He felt a strange mix of guilt and curiosity as he called out, asking who was singing. The moment he spoke though, the singing stopped, and the mist began to rotate as if turning to face him. Despite its human shape, Mark knew it wasn't a living person. When the mist stopped, he could vaguely make out a woman's face. The features were faint, but the shape of her eyes stood out. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the mist blew away like a puff of smoke. Mark simply stood there bewildered before returning to his work. As he finished digging the grave, his thoughts kept drifting back to the encounter, and he found himself glancing repeatedly at the spot where the mist had been. The next day was the funeral. Although Mark didn't attend, he helped with the setup and takedown. As he was folding up the chairs and removing the fake grass carpet, he saw a large photo of the deceased on an easel. It had her name, dates of birth and death, and a poem about life and loss. Mark couldn't take his eyes off the photograph though. He was certain that the eyes in the picture were the same ones he had seen in the mist the previous day. Mark believes that the woman's spirit was watching over him, perhaps to ensure he did a good job, or maybe she thought singing to him would make his work easier. Either way, it was the only time he ever experienced anything out of the ordinary while digging graves. Infinity in Pennsylvania, a Serpent Hill. William Johnson grew up in Somerset County, Pennsylvania, where a schoolhouse stood in a remote field. The field was so difficult to access that students spent a good part of each morning walking there. In 1925 though, Annie Whitney and Caroline Bullock collected folklore for a journal article, and Johnson shared a strange memory from when he was 16, likely in 1886. He remembered his school being haunted by a colossal serpent. The haunting began after a new building was constructed on the school site in Jenner Township, 16 miles west of Johnstown. The building was on an old crossroads which an old man had warned was haunted. As soon as the building was completed, a gigantic serpent began to appear regularly. Although its head and tail were never seen, its scaly body, over a foot in diameter, lay across public highways leading to the schoolhouse. Students often had to cross over the serpent to attend evening events at the school. Johnson described the serpent's scales as sharp, and anyone who accidentally touched it would stick to it before being thrown to the ground. Interestingly, not everyone could see the serpent, but everyone felt its presence and experienced the same reaction if they stepped on it. The serpent's presence extended beyond the schoolhouse though, affecting various properties in the area. A man named Frame was so terrified that he sold his property and moved away. Joe Leversos bought the haunted house and raised a large family there without issue, as the community had adapted to the serpent's presence. Local men sometimes attempted to attack the serpent with objects like fence stakes, though these efforts had no effect. Johnson also named other witnesses to the haunting, including Joe Boyer and preacher Jeremiah Mowry. Despite numerous sightings though, the serpent's head and tail were never seen, suggesting it might have been at least a mile long. Johnson moved away from the town at age 30 around the turn of the 20th century, and the serpent continued to manifest. Relax, you didn't see anything. Shannon, a professional massage therapist with 7 years of experience, had become accustomed to the routine of her job. Most of her clients were athletes and office workers seeking relief from the stresses of their demanding lives. Although she occasionally encountered clients who made her uncomfortable, she had learned to navigate these situations with professionalism. Nothing, however, could have prepared her for the strange events involving one of her regular clients. One of Shannon's clients, a man who introduced himself as John, seemed completely ordinary. He owned a mortgage business and often mentioned the stress of his job, with its endless number crunching and long hours at a desk. John had a standing appointment every Thursday, arriving punctually and preferring not to engage in much conversation. Shannon found him slightly odd, but he never crossed any professional boundaries, which was a relief in her line of work. For almost 2 years, she performed a regular massage for him every week. One Thursday though, John didn't show up for his appointment. There was no call, no message, nothing. Shannon found it unusual since he had never missed a session before. Concerned, she tried calling him early the following week, but discovered that his phone was disconnected. Puzzled but not overly concerned, she left the time slot open by coincidence as no one else booked that hour. To her surprise, John appeared the following Thursday at his usual time. When she mentioned his disconnected work number, he mumbled something unintelligible, prompting her to drop the topic. As Shannon began the massage, she noticed something strange. John's skin felt unusually cold, a detail she had never observed before. He turned over onto his back and she continued working. Suddenly, his cell phone, which was on a nearby table, began to ring loudly. John's eyes then snapped open, and Shannon was horrified to see that they were completely black. She recoiled, stepping away from him in shock. For a moment, John stared at her with those unsettling eyes. The phone stopped ringing and he closed his eyes, exhaling loudly. When he reopened them, they appeared somewhat normal again, though still very dark. John spoke in a monotone voice, telling her that she hadn't seen anything and that everything was fine. Shannon, however, was far from fine. She began yelling at him to leave her office, turning her head away in distress. John continued speaking in the same flat tone, insisting that she relax and forget what she had seen. Shannon's fear escalated though, and she fled her office through the side door to call her friend, a fellow massage therapist. Her friend arrived quickly, and together they re-entered the office. John though was gone. Reflecting on the incident, Shannon realized she had never seen John's eyes before that day. He always wore mirrored sunglasses when he arrived and left, and kept his eyes closed during the massage. It dawned on her that he had made a conscious effort to conceal his eyes. Determined to uncover more about John, Shannon and her friend searched for his business online and in phone directories but found no listing. Investigating further, they discovered that the disconnected phone number had previously belonged to a pizza delivery service. This strange revelation added to the mystery, making Shannon question who or what John really was. Shannon remains convinced that she never saw John's eyes prior to that incident, leaving her to wonder if her fear had exaggerated details or if her memory was accurate. The monotone speech and unsettling behavior he exhibited were reminiscent of encounters with black-eyed children, leading her to speculate that John had tried to manipulate her perception and memory of the event. Drained in Delhi. Living in Delhi, Samir shared a bedroom with his older brother during a particularly hot summer when an unsettling series of events began to unfold. At 17, Samir often found it difficult to sleep due to the oppressive heat, while his brother, who was 19, managed to rest well, at least at first. However, over a few weeks, Samir noticed his brother becoming increasingly exhausted despite claiming to sleep through the nights. He mentioned having strange dreams but couldn't provide more details. One night, Samir was awake, enjoying a rare cool breeze blowing through their open window. The usual noise of Delhi's night seemed distant as an inexplicable feeling of unease washed over him. His eyes were drawn to the window where he saw what appeared to be a shadowy figure in the form of a person. This dark silhouette, lacking any discernible features, seemed to move with a fluid, snake-like motion. Samir watched in frozen terror as it slithered over the windowsill and onto the floor, moving silently across the room toward his brother's bed. Trying to ensure he wasn't dreaming, Samir pinched himself hard, the pain confirming his dreadful reality. The shadow creature glided to his brother's bed and began to position itself over him. Despite his fear, Samir couldn't look away. He knew he was witnessing something otherworldly. The moment the entity settled on top of his brother, Samir's instincts kicked in and he shouted his brother's name. The creature then turned its gaze towards Samir, revealing the face of a woman, an expression of anger etched into its shadowy features. Panicking, Samir jumped out of the bed and turned on the light. In the sudden brightness, he saw the creature retreat, slithering out the window with the same eerie grace it had entered. He then rushed to wake his brother, who was groggy and confused. Their father, alarmed by the commotion, entered the room. Upon hearing Samir's account, he turned pale and explained that what Samir had seen was a spirit draining his brother's life force, or prana. The following day, they sought the help of a holy man who performed rituals to protect them from further attacks. Fortunately, Samir's brother recovered quickly and the entity never returned. Despite the resolution though, Samir remained haunted by the experience. He struggled with sleep, fearing the shadowy woman might return. The squonk in the cabin. Wayne had been a plumber for nearly 30 years, following in his father's footsteps and eventually taking over the family business. He handled mostly residential and small business calls, enjoying the freedom of being self-employed. One day though, he received a call from a homeowner who was concerned about the smell of sewage coming from under her house. The residence was an old log cabin surrounded by hemlock trees, and it showed signs of age. As Wayne approached the house, the smell of sewage was unmistakable. He spoke with the homeowner to get details about when she first noticed the odor and if there had been any issues with slow drains or toilet problems. She had no basement, only a crawl space, which made Wayne kinda groan knowing that messy work awaited him. He removed a section of latticework to access the crawl space and put on a headlamp. Brushing away tangled spiderwebs, he crawled in, dragging his tool bag along. The smell of raw sewage grew stronger as he moved further in, and the clearance lessened, forcing him into an army crawl. Eventually, he found the problem, being a section of cast iron piping had rusted apart at an elbow, causing a big puddle of sewage. He groaned again but got to work, knowing that this was part of the job. Wayne cut away the rusted pipes and patched in new material. As he finished and began gathering his tools, he heard a strange sniffling noise, like someone with a cold or someone who had been crying. Thinking it might be the homeowner, he called out, but there was no response. The noise continued, which piqued his curiosity. He looked around with his headlamp and saw an animal nest with various white bones scattered around it, likely bird bones or small mammals. As Wayne started crawling back out, he saw something skitter in his peripheral vision, being a pale, hairless animal that reminded him of a small pig. It moved with a strange fluid motion and he heard the sniffling noise again. He followed the noise to a far corner of the crawl space where his light revealed the creature more clearly. It wasn't a pig, but it had a dome-shaped head, 2 bright eyes, and 8 flailing tentacles as long as a man's arm. Its skin was wrinkly with warts or moles covering it, and it even had small tusks at the edge of its mouth. Its eyes were also watering as if it were sick or crying. The creature cowered against the lattice, scratching and clawing at the wood, trying to escape. Wayne spoke to it softly, trying to calm it down. He reached out to touch it, but before he could, the lattice gave way and the creature fled into the woods. Wayne thought about chasing it, but decided against, causing more damage to the crawl space. He crawled back out the way he came and circled the cabin, finding some flattened grass but no other signs of the creature. Wayne then packed up his gear, changed uniforms, and went to the house to give the woman her bill. He mentioned seeing an animal under the cabin, but didn't give specifics. She suggested it might have been a raccoon, but Wayne knew it wasn't. He didn't tell much people about the encounter, not wanting to be seen as someone who saw mysterious creatures. He only told his wife and brother, who seemed to believe him. A couple of years later though, his brother called saying he had figured out what Wayne had seen. He showed Wayne an old book he had bought at a yard sale, Fearsome Creatures of the Lumberwoods. Inside was an illustration of a creature called the squonk, which looked just like what Wayne had seen. Wayne had never heard of it before, but now believed in it completely. A dangerous delivery. Nate was hired by a big package delivery company in his mid-20s. Starting off as a handler in the warehouse, he put in his time and eventually transitioned to a driver in a few years. He enjoyed the work even though it was hard and demanding with long hours. The days on the road were rewarding, allowing him to see parts of the state he would have never seen otherwise. And he especially liked the remote deliveries, finding a sense of adventure in the back roads, empty fields, and pastures. One autumn day though, Nate was sent out on a delivery deep into a wooded valley. The route took him through dirt roads and horse trails, pushing his old truck's suspension to its limits. After navigating the rugged terrain, he arrived at a pretty log cabin nestled among the trees. The homeowner, a kind woman, thanked him for coming all the way out there. Nate assured her it was part of the job and no inconvenience at all. As the sun began to set, Nate retraced his route, eager to get back to civilization before dark. He drove faster than usual, trying to make up time on the poor road conditions. About 5 miles from the cabin though, he noticed something moving in the trees. Slowing the truck to a crawl, he expected a deer to dart out. He gave the horn a quick toot to scare off any wildlife, but nothing crossed his path. As he resumed driving, he saw movement again, this time a blur of brown fur through the thick tree cover. Nate stopped the truck completely, trying to get a better look. Assuming it was a deer, he honked the horn again, longer this time. The sound echoed back at him, and he felt sure it would scare off any animal. But as he prepared to drive away, he heard branches breaking and turned to see a massive figure emerging from the forest. To his shock, a Bigfoot stepped onto the road. The creature pushed through the brush and stood in the middle of the road, staring directly at him. Nate, startled, flinched and accidentally jammed his foot on the gas, causing the truck to lurch forward. The Bigfoot remained unfazed, its eyes shining in the headlights. Standing between 7 and 8 feet tall, with thick muscular arms and legs, it had an ape-like face and an imposing presence. The Bigfoot didn't move towards Nate, but its gaze made it clear who the apex predator was. After a moment, it turned and continued walking across the road, covering the distance in just 3 giant strides. It then simply disappeared into the trees on the other side. Nate sat in the truck, trembling, trying to process what he had just seen. Nate had never given much thought to Bigfoot, dismissing it as a myth. Now, having seen one up close, he was unsure what to do. Instinctively, he reached for his phone to call the warehouse, but hesitated, realizing he had no idea what to say. He knew no one would believe him and feared becoming a laughingstock, or worse, losing his job. Deciding against making the call, Nate set the phone down and took one last look in the direction the Bigfoot had gone. Seeing nothing, he drove away, hoping he would never encounter the creature again. Transparent levitating ball. Around 1990, on a mild, somewhat overcast day in the typical suburban neighborhood of Santa Rosa, California, an unusual event took place. Basically, a resident was preparing to leave the house to run errands around 11 a.m. Suddenly though, from inside the house, the sound of a car horn going on and off was heard. This was strange because the car in question was an old 1978 Dodge Volare, which did not have a car alarm system. The horn was annoying, especially since the car was parked across the street on the curb on a quiet neighborhood. Grabbing the keys, the resident then went to investigate, but as soon as the front door was open, the horn stopped. After finishing the preparations, the resident headed out to the car. Stepping into the quiet street, they noticed something really weird about 30 yards away. A transparent floating ball levitating about 3 feet above the pavement was coming towards them in a straight, unwavering path. This was especially odd considering the strange phenomena recently experienced in the remote forests of Northern California, where the resident had lived for some time before arriving in Santa Rosa a few days prior. The floating ball, about the size of a basketball and perfectly round, appeared to be completely transparent. It seemed as though it wanted to be invisible, not changing shape or size and moving at about walking speed. Despite the oddity though, the resident was not startled or scared, but felt an urge to get into the vehicle before the ball reached them, feeling somewhat anxious. Calmly, the resident took the keys, unlocked the door, and quickly got inside of the car, shutting the door behind them. By now, the ball was approaching the front of the car, floating at about side view mirror height. It floated right by the driver's side window, continuing its straight path. Watching it through the side view mirror, the resident saw the ball turn the corner in the road. It could be seen in the rear view mirror until it moved along and out of sight. An encounter in the woods. Around the fall of 1983, just south of Camp Lenape outside of Medford, New Jersey, an unforgettable event occurred involving a young Boy Scout who was about 13 or 14 years old at the time. This boy, influenced by his family's respect for nature and their skepticism towards ghost or monster stories, found himself in a situation that would challenge his beliefs. His family had moved to New Jersey from McFord AFB in Washington after a brief stay in Pennsylvania. Growing up, he heard tales of Bigfoot and other legendary creatures, but his father, a military man with little patience for such stories, often dismissed them as figments of overactive imaginations. Wanting to prove himself to his father and dismissing the notion of monsters as nonsense, the boy never spoke of the event that haunted him for 36 years. As a Boy Scout, he often camped in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey, a place filled with stories of the Jersey Devil. One particular night, after setting up camp and completing all necessary tasks, he headed to the river to fish, intending to spend the entire night there. Some younger scouts also accompanied him until dark, but they eventually left for the campfire and s'mores, leaving him alone. The night was uneventful until a few hours after dark. Deciding that an all-nighter wasn't worth it, he began the trek back to camp. As he walked along the trail, he heard a strange groaning sound he couldn't identify. Assuming it was the wind or some natural noise, he continued, but soon noticed an unusual smell growing stronger as he walked. Turning a corner on the path, he saw what he initially thought was a dead tree obstructing his view. It appeared to move slightly, which he dismissed as a trick of the dark. But as he got closer, the smell intensified, and the tree seemed to widen. Thinking he might have taken a wrong turn, he decided to use his flashlight. In that instant, he realized what he was looking at was not a tree. The creature before him looked like a cross between a rearing horse or a donkey with wings that spread out as it moved. It made a small leap and went straight up through the opening in the trees, disappearing into the night. Terrified and unsure of what he had just witnessed, he didn't mention the encounter to anyone. That night, he lay in his tent clutching a knife, prepared to scream at the slightest noise. The following morning, when some of the other scouts wanted to go fishing, he reluctantly joined them but soon made an excuse to investigate the area alone. He found hoof prints in the spot where he had seen the creature, but nowhere else. He asked the scoutmaster if there were any plans for horsemanship activities or if anyone was nearby with horses, only to be told they were alone in the woods that weekend. Despite returning to New Jersey for basic training at 18, he never mentioned the incident, fearing ridicule or disbelief. Now, decades later, he still recalls that night with a lump in his throat, unable to explain away what he saw. His silence was a testament to the impact of the encounter, and the fear of being labeled crazy or unreliable kept the story buried for years. To this day, the memory still remains vivid. The creature's appearance, the smell, and the way it moved are details that haven't faded. Whether it was just part of his imagination or something real, he knew he had seen something that wasn't supposed to be there. Encounter with shadowy entity. Hydro King from the US shared a collection of creepy dreams experienced over the past 3 years. Basically, during a summer night, he went to bed as usual without any prior events that might trigger a nightmare. Initially, his dream was typical, filled with random images and memories, until it abruptly changed. He found himself sitting alone in his living room that night. Hearing a knock on the door, he got up and opened it without hesitation. On the other side was a tall, slender, shadowy figure. The entity was so tall that it had to bend down to fit through the doorframe. Its figures resembled long, razor-like blades, and its legs were thin black rods. He felt an intense sense of dread and horror at the sight of it. The figure tried to crawl through the door, reaching out and saying in a deep hollow voice, "7 years you will be with me." He managed to push the figure back outside, close the door, and lock it. Upon waking, he was shaking and unable to sleep for an hour. This nightmare might have been dismissed as a one-time event if it weren't for the recurring nature of the dreams. In subsequent dreams, the entity would appear on his driveway, either reaching out or chasing him. It would sometimes laugh maniacally or mock him as he rushed through the front door to lock it behind him. He felt that this creature was a distorted reflection of himself. The nightmares stopped for about a year though when he began meditating. However, they returned about a week ago from the writing. This recent dream started with him at a restaurant with his second grade teacher, who he had become friends with. After leaving the restaurant and saying their goodbyes, he noticed a dark figure standing in front of the restaurant. It had the same unsettling presence as the previous entity, but looked different. It resembled his second grade teacher, but wore all black clothes, had black hair instead of gray, with its eyes covered in a shadowy fog, and it never stopped smiling. The figure noticed him and stared at him. He quickly got into his car and drove home. The dream then jumped to different scenarios where the entity was always watching him, sometimes clawing at him or chasing him. In the dream, he saw help from a psychic medium asking her about the entity while it stood next to him. The psychic didn't know what it was and the creature laughed at her lack of knowledge. The dream then shifted to him being at a friend's house. This friend, a former Buddhist monk, told him that the entity was neither a demon nor a spirit, but a dark energy attached to him, taking the form of something memorable. Upon waking from this particular dream, he felt unable to sleep again. He ended up researching shadow people, but none of the descriptions matched what he saw. The entity never had red eyes and never appeared outside of his dreams, though he often felt watched upon waking. Meditation had seemed to help before, but now it no longer seemed effective. He saw advice on identifying and getting rid of this dark energy. The recurring presence of the dark entity in his dreams and its disturbing nature left him seeking answers and any sort of solutions. Shadow Figure Demon. Bloodshot Eyes from the US shared a series of otherworldly encounters that began a little over 2 years ago during her honeymoon. Throughout her life, she has experienced unexplainable phenomena, especially around the nights of the full moon. However, the events that started on her honeymoon have been particularly disturbing. While staying in a cabin one night by the fireplace just after an intimate moment with her husband, she noticed a black figure standing still watching them. She was frightened but didn't mention it to her husband. The figure then reappeared next to the bed as soon as she lay down, prompting her to tell her husband about it. But he couldn't see anything, and by morning, she convinced herself that she might have been imagining things. Upon returning to the new apartment, the sightings became more frequent. Every night, she saw the shadow figure in the spare bedroom through the slightly open door. She tried keeping the door closed, but it always ended up open, possibly due to her husband. Fearful that acknowledging the entity's presence might provoke it, she kept her experiences to herself. The figure's experiences extended to the bedroom though. One night, during an intimate moment with her husband, she saw it standing in the corner even with the light on. This led to a breakdown where she finally confided in her husband about her ongoing torment. He still couldn't see the figure but tried to comfort her. For a while, the setting stopped and she felt relieved, thinking that speaking about it had somehow dispelled the entity. However, the figure recently appeared, but only in the dark and usually when she was alone. Aware of how the eyes can play tricks in low light, she remained skeptical about her own perceptions. However, an incident that occurred one night felt different and much clearer. This night stood out because it was far from being a full moon, yet the figure's presence was unmistakable. She went to her bedroom to retrieve her computer and saw her husband lying in his usual spot on the bed. They had planned to be intimate earlier, so she was surprised he had stopped gaming early for it. Smiling, she was about to join him when she noticed he wasn't looking at his phone, something he always did. There was no phone light on his face, raising her suspicions. She pulled out her phone to use the flashlight, hearing a rustling sound from his direction. When she turned on the light, there was nothing there, not even the bedding arranged as if someone had been lying on it. The room was dimly lit by a streetlight through the window, and she had clearly seen his head before turning on her light. Suddenly though, she heard him again downstairs, still playing his video game, despite not hearing him before. Her immediate reaction was to laugh it off and calmly go downstairs to her husband, but as soon as she sat on the couch, the encounter began to worry her. She didn't keep it to herself this time, but she felt her husband thought she was joking. Research into incubi only heightened her fear, as traditional beliefs describe such entities as attacking during sleep, not appearing as a doppelganger while awake. Now, she still finds herself afraid to sleep or do anything alone, deeply disturbed by the figure that continues to haunt her and unsure where to turn for answers. Harpies of Pelotas City. In the 1950s, Lucy Gerlach Real and her husband Luis de Rosario Real had an unsettling experience while walking along a moonlit forest trail near the coastal city of Pelotas in southern Brazil. This encounter, documented in a South American journal first published in 1976, has become known as the Harpies of Pelotas City. The couple was enjoying a peaceful evening walk when they noticed two large silhouettes swooping up above the forest canopy. Initially, they assumed these shapes were oversized birds gracefully soaring through the sky. However, as the creatures descended and landed on the trail in front of them, it became clear that these were not birds. The beings stood much taller than any bird the Reals had ever seen and had bodies that looked uncannily humanoid. As Lucy and Louise watched in stunned silence, the creatures crouched down as if trying to avoid detection. This behavior, combined with their strange appearance, caused a deep sense of unease to wash over the couple. They felt as though they were being stalked by these winged humanoids, a chilling realization that spurred them into action. Following their instincts, they decided to flee the scene, running back along the trail to safety. Louise later expressed regret for not staying to learn more about the beings, but the fear they inspired had been overwhelming. The encounter left them with more questions than answers, a mystery that lingered in their minds long after the event. The experience of seeing these winged humanoids was further explored in Ken Gerhard's book Encounters with Flying Humanoids, which delves into similar settings and strange entities observed around the world. A Nightmare in Detroit. In the 1950s, William Adams, working the midnight shift at the local Cadillac plant in Detroit, Michigan, found himself regularly sleeping in the back bedroom of his home on Martin Street. This small, seemingly ordinary room soon became a source of relentless nightmares. Despite its unremarkable appearance, the room's atmosphere felt tangibly wrong. The children and the family dog instinctively avoided it, but William and his wife Lillian initially dismissed this behavior. One night, William woke up from a disturbing dream to find himself paralyzed with fear, screaming uncontrollably. The nightmares in the back bedroom were unlike anything he had ever experienced. Each time he slept there, he was tormented by horrifying visions and a suffocating sense of dread. After losing considerable sleep, he considered seeking psychiatric help, but found that the nightmare ceased when he resumed sleeping in the master bedroom. The couple chalked it up to personal stress until an unexpected visit from William's grandmother. In August 1962, Grandmother Adams came from Georgia for a visit and was given the back room. The following morning, she appeared visibly shaken and pale, recounting her night of terrible sounds and eerie disturbances. This revelation was the first indication to the Adams family that something was seriously wrong with the room. They began to pay closer attention to earlier incidents they had ignored, like their children's avoidance of the room and the dog's refusal to enter it. Seeking an objective perspective, the Adams invited an old family friend, Shirley Patterson, to stay in the room during his visit on October 27th. Patterson, considered practical and no-nonsense, was not told about the family's experiences. Shortly after lying down, he felt an inexplicable force turn over him, and he saw a woman standing outside the doorway. Initially, he thought it was Lillian, but the realization that it was not her, and perhaps not even human, filled him with fear. As he ran towards the figure, all the lights in the house went out. The woman then vanished, and an awful, mournful scream echoed through the house, followed by a sickening smell. A trapdoor in the utility room then opened and slammed shut on its own. Patterson and Lillian eventually called the police. The police arrived and searched the house, including the attic and the partially dug out basement, but found no rational explanation for the events. When William returned from his shift and heard what had happened, he decided to confront the entity himself. On Saturday night, he lay down in the back bedroom, determined to face whatever was there. After a while, he heard movement and assumed it was Lillian. However, when he turned over, he saw a hideous face inches away from him. The creature's eyes stared through him, and it emitted a hissing sound and a foul stench. William's reaction was immediate and violent. He leapt out of the bed, screaming and tearing his hair out in uncontrollable terror. Lillian and Patterson had to wrestle him to the floor to calm him down. The sickening smell permeated the house once again. Within an hour, the Adams family had fled their home, taking their sleeping children to stay with neighbors. The next morning, they moved in with William's parents in Dearborn. They retrieved their belongings from the Martin Street house through daylight visits and never returned. The final chapter in the Martin Street haunting occurred when Leo Sanoki and his sister Virginia visited the house to verify the Adams' story. Leo spent a few minutes lying in the back bedroom before rushing out in a panic, refusing to disclose what he had seen. The landlady later refused to allow paranormal investigators into the house, leaving the mystery unsolved. Aliens took his watch and his photo. So this case revolves around Oliver Peterson's encounter with extraterrestrial visitors in 1950. Basically, as Peterson walked home on the 5th of May, he witnessed 2 flying saucers, one of which landed in a nearby field. The lid of the saucer then opened, and several very handsome men and women emerged. They carried themselves with an air of confidence and seemed friendly, which perhaps made the subsequent events even more surreal. One of the visitors then produced an object resembling a photographic machine. After taking photos of Peterson, they showed him the developed pictures just 3 minutes later, and the photos were in color, a remarkable feat for that time. The aliens then measured Peterson with a device that he couldn't identify. After the measurements, they started digging into the ground to collect plants and flowers, which they placed in a small box. Things took a strange turn though when the aliens suddenly took Peterson's book, fountain pen, watch, and wallet without asking for his permission. They seemed to smile the entire time, and it felt more like a mugging than more of an encounter. The whole event was over quickly as the aliens re-entered their saucer, which was about 25 feet in diameter, and departed with a rushing sound similar to that of small jet engines. They left behind a burnt patch on the ground as physical evidence of their visit. Peterson tried to show the burn patch to some of his friends and shared his story, but he quickly gave up when no one believed him. His neighbor, Harold Heggenby, later recounted the story to a newspaper, vouching for Peterson's reliability and honesty. Heggenby described Peterson as a reliable citizen who would never lie, lending some credibility to the tale. Despite the strangeness of the encounter though, Peterson never heard from the space visitors again. Alcoholic apparition of Clark Alley. West Clark Alley in York, Pennsylvania was once the stage of one of the most surreal spectral phenomena recorded in Forteana. The Clark Alley imp made its first appearance in January 1880, and it was known to take on various bizarre forms, each stranger than the last. The entity's ability to transform itself confounded and terrified the local residents, becoming a significant piece of the folklore there. The Clark Alley imp was initially observed by a group of Victorian ghost hunters who saw what appeared to be a young boy selling newspapers. When approached, the boy vanished in a puff of smoke, leaving behind a scrap of paper covered in unintelligible writings. This event set the stone for subsequent encounters with the imp, making it a creature that could shift its appearance and escape capture with ease. Residents soon reported seeing the imp in different guises. Sometimes it appeared as a human figure with the demeanor of a horse thief, but more often it manifested as a huge demijohn on 2 legs or a beer bottle, tapped at both ends, rolling menacingly along the alley. The latter forms were particularly disturbing as they seemed to animate in ways that defied natural explanation. The alley dwellers would chase these apparitions up and down the lane, but they could never touch or catch them, much like the elusive will-o'-the-wisp. One notable incident occurred a few days before the imp's initial appearance. A group of curious Victorian ghost hunters spotted the apparition. They described it as a slender feminine figure clad in black, which they encountered on King Street. The figure though disappeared as abruptly as it appeared. The imp's final reported manifestation though took place in South Court Alley, where it seemed to haunt a stable by emitting the sounds of hay being thrown around. Interestingly, this haunting was entirely auditory with no physical evidence of hay being disturbed. Despite the numerous sightings and the strange events associated with the imp though, it vanished as quickly as it appeared. Ghost truck experience near Sherry Manson. On May 22, 2000, after completing his junior year at Sherryland High School, George attended the graduation ceremony with his friend, Pat Dickerson. The ceremony, like many in South Texas, was long and warm. Afterward, they chatted with friends and then decided to get something to eat before heading to Pat's house. Pat lived out past 107 on 8 Mile, far from the school and very secluded and dark. They were moving the next day to a house closer to the school. As they drove up to Sherry Road though, which in 2000 was a mix of rural neighborhoods and orchards, they passed the Sherry Mansion, which was a place known for its paranormal rumors. The mansion had a reputation for ghost sightings and other eerie experiences. So it was around 9 p.m. and the long day had left them quiet, listening to music. George then noticed a truck following closely behind him in his rearview mirror. The truck wanted to pass, but it was a 2-lane road, one lane going north and the other south. For about half a mile, the truck still followed them. As they passed the Sherry Mansion, the truck suddenly gunned its engine and attempted to pass them, despite an oncoming car. George then braced for an accident, but the thing was, there was no sound of screeching tires or a collision. When he checked the rearview mirror, the southbound car's taillights were visible, but the truck had vanished. It had simply disappeared in the split second that they passed the Sherry Mansion. George and Pat then sat in stunned silence. George wondered if he was just tired and imagining things, but when he looked at Pat, he saw the same confusion and disbelief. Pat remarked, "Did you see that?" They both checked the mirrors again, but the truck was simply gone. They couldn't explain what happened. The truck had seemingly vanished without a trace. The next day, while moving furniture, they drove by the same spot. They looked for any sort of skid marks, wreckage, or any hidden entrances, but found nothing. The road was as it had always been, with no clues to explain the disappearance of any truck whatsoever. They concluded that they had encountered a phantom truck on Sherry Road, an experience that left a lasting impression on George. Since that night, George has driven through the area multiple times, hoping to see the phantom truck again, but has been disappointed each time. The memory of that night, the sudden disappearance, and the eerie silence around the Sherry Mansion still plague him. Despite the rational explanations that he and Pat sought the day after though, the encounter still remains unexplained and continues to haunt George.